All right, and we are live. Welcome everyone to this session of Malu Journey webinars. And today we are in our very first session talking about seasons of change. So if you are joining us live right now, I would love it if you can just drop into the LinkedIn comment box. Let us know where are you calling in from and how is the weather where you are? Because I'm currently sitting at a moderate 90 degrees with probably way too much humidity that my hair can handle at the moment. So, with that said, I would love to welcome Melissa and Michelle today to join us for the very first round of our conversation. And we are talking about seasons of change, which might be a very good topic considering the literal seasons we're going through right now. So, Michelle and Melissa, I would love it if both of you can introduce yourself. And true to the Malu Journey standards, I'm going to ask you to introduce yourself in two ways. Number one, how would you introduce yourself in a professional setting? And two, tell us who you are without your job title. Melissa, why don't you start? And Michelle, we can move over to you.
All right. Okay, so professional. Hi, everyone. I'm Melissa Ingoldner, founder of Fit for Future and Malu. I help Fortune 500s and founders alike design systems that don't just scale, they heal. And my background spans across organizational change, large scale transformation, and strategy. Without the title, I think I'm a former good girl, overachiever, turned corporate unlearner. I help people and systems stop pretending that they're fine. And I'm also a mother too, daughter of immigrants, and someone who believes that your breakdowns are often your breakthroughs.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that. And Michelle, over to you.
I love that. Still taking it in. Okay, professionally, title wise, I teach at the Stanford Design School, or the D School as it's affectionately known. And I've taught there for almost 10 years, mostly focused on design research, qualitative design research. So, talking to people to understand them and their worlds. And there's a course we've been teaching for a long time called Need Finding, which goes back to the 70s. And I get to teach with Professor Michael Berry and a bunch of other amazing people. And so there we focus mostly on helping engineers understand the human side of design and human needs. And then the other side of my professional life is consulting, like doing research for different organizations who want to better understand who they're serving. And what we try to do is bring a really deep, nuanced, human centered understanding. Because it's hard. Like when you're an organization, you see the world through your metrics or through the graphs and all these abstractions. And on one hand, those tools are needed, but it's very easy to lose track of how people are actually feeling and what they're experiencing. So that's the other side of me professionally. Non-professionally, I think I'm just a very curious person and have really resisted being put in different buckets. I was like that in school. I'm like that now that I'm working. It's very much like, I think there's a lot to be learned from paying deep attention to people, more than often meets the eye. And so I think I'm a big nerd about that. Like, how do you talk to people in a way to deeply understand what's happening with them? How do you really hear what they're saying, even when they're not explicitly telling it to you? But their heart is trying to tell you something. That's what I'm kind of a geek about, regardless of where we're.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that. And we do have Petra joining us from Czech Republic. So thank you for dialing in, Petra. Again, guys, we are live. So any questions, comments, concerns, anything you have throughout this entire session, just drop them in the LinkedIn Live comment box. We do see them in our back end. So definitely we'll be addressing them as this session continues. I totally forgot to introduce myself. So if you are new to my face, if you're new to my voice, hi everyone, Lydia Wu here of Whoops Did I Think Out Loud. I think this is the first time in my life where my professional and my personal introductions have finally aligned. Took 30 odd not years, but here we are, better late than never. Long story short, I self-describe as a technologist as well as a content creator. And I also describe myself as a former HR executive currently in detox and recovery mode. So with that said, Melissa, Michelle, I know you guys have a very, very interesting how did we meet story. So can we please share that with the audience?
Michelle, why don't you go first?
Okay. Melissa and I were on a project together many years ago, and we were working for different companies at the time. And it was one of those things where I think corporate logic would have led us to at least be competitive, because it's like, oh no, here's another consulting company, like this is, we got to make sure we do a good job. Um, and it was just, that was so not the vibe. Like we were secretly back messaging each other, like, that was really cool what you said. I really like that. Um, and I love that. So it was like sort of a natural friendship that came through working together. And then Melissa, then you reached out very recently. So I don't know
Yes.
the story.
My side of the story is Michelle just has this wonderful knack for storytelling, and she's the one who actually is the person that has helped me fall in love with research. So I don't know if you know that, Michelle, and has really impacted me on the research that we did with the study of the fear of irrelevance. But you just have a wonderful way of taking data and talking about it in a way that really moves you and gets to the heart of things. And so there was no other person that I wanted to lead the research project other than you, Michelle.
That's so nice. Thanks.
Awesome. And with that research and the notion of how you guys came together in mind, I know we're here to talk about change management. But before we get into the nitty gritty of change management, the mushiness of what it means to be human, and all of that fun stuff, can we just talk for a moment of your instinctive gut reaction these days when you hear the words change management? Melissa, I'm going to start with you, then Michelle will move to you.
So this is ironic because my whole background has been like change management, but to be quite honest with you, the entire time that I have been in this arena, I think the best word, the modern day word right now that's, maybe it's not modern anymore, but is ick, the ick, it sounds more like a compliance protocol for something that's actually should be sacred. You don't manage change, you metabolize it, you meet it, you move through it. So I think, in my experience, I feel like people try to, command and control it, like change manage it, where we actually need more courage and consciousness. I also think that the language or the old language was like manage, execute, roll out. But if you think about human language, we're seasonal, we're cyclical, we're alive. And I think that's one reason why I wanted to embark in Malu, because we're using more different language in terms of like shedding skin, crossing bridges, burning maps, because change isn't something you do to people, it's something you move through with them.
Yeah, for sure. And before we move on to Michelle, because Melissa, you did mention that's how you started and why you started Malu Journey. Talk to us a little bit more. What is Malu Journey?
Oh my goodness. Well, Malu Journey came from a big kind of shake up your life or like pull the carpet off from the bottom of your feet moment, where I had been laid off at an organization when I was a partner in a management consulting company. And that was such an aha moment because I had no idea that my identity was so raveled up in my velocity of achieving awards or accolades or milestones, that I was living somebody else's dream, because if it was my own dream, I would experience joy while doing it. I was trying to desperately be one of the 3 positions that my immigrant parents recommended, which was a partner of a management consulting company like my father, a doctor or a lawyer. And I had this aha moment that if it was my dream, I wouldn't be so stressed out, and I would feel a sense of alignment. And ever since then, I want to be able to take that alignment and have other people experience that. So that is the foundation or the why behind Malu. And Malu is an ecosystem of therapists and coaches that help women that are going through a personal or professional transition get access to workshops that introduce a plethora of different modalities, from like cognitive behavioral therapy, somatic therapy, trauma, identity, all the way to coaching modalities in terms of goal setting, networking, because I don't believe that you should compartmentalize your holistic needs, right? So we have therapy that oftentimes addresses your past to your present, and then coaching to help you with the present to your future. But why aren't we addressing our whole selves? And that is the foundation of Malu.
Amazing. Thank you for that. Michelle, bringing it back to you, change management. What's the instinctive reaction? How do you feel about those two words coming together?
I feel very similarly to Melissa. Even we've had different backgrounds and different ways of
Mhm.
interacting with change management. Um, I think I feel suspicious. I'm like, who are you to come in? Who decided what change needs to happen? Do I have any say in it? And I'm just the thing to be managed. Like, okay, it feels like there's not a lot of room for dialogue or co-creation in it, which is upsetting because I think, to what you were saying earlier, Melissa, change is, I think, one of the spaces in human life where there's the most opportunity for connection, actually, and vulnerability, and actually meeting people where they are. And so, for that to become a site of, as you were saying, compliance, is really awful. I think the promise of it is really lofty, and then actually getting executed, it's often really disappointing or even alienating how it happens on the ground.
Yeah, I definitely hear you. I was on a podcast a while back, and I think one of the things that we were talking about is saying change management in the enterprise world is basically saying things like toddler management or puppy or kitten management. There are certain forces of nature that you can't just stick in a box and call it a day. So, if you are in the audience and joining us live right now, we would love to hear your thoughts on what your perspective is when you hear the two words change management. And if it gives you the ick, if you think it's the right terminology to use, and just your perception about it overall. So, when we were in the green room and when we were preparing for this session, we talked a lot about how, from a change management perspective and behavioral change perspective, there is a lens of one to many versus many to one in terms of, are you driving it towards the individual or are you driving it towards the organization? Melissa, I would love to know from your perspective and all of your experience and practices, how do you balance the individual person and the greater organization in executing change and managing change programs?
I feel like I have a very distinct point of view on this, but I don't believe you balance them. I think you integrate them because the organization is human. It's just people in pattern behavior. So if your strategy is ignoring grief, if it's ignoring fear, if it's ignoring identity loss, good luck sustaining change. I think the myth we've sold for decades is that transformation is about the organization evolving, but the truth is organizations don't transform. The people do, right? And so I remember working with a client where we're doing everything right, strong comms, great training, lots of incentives, but behind the scenes, people were burning out. They were self-doubting. They were afraid to speak up. And so, transformation has to serve the people inside of the system. Otherwise, it's just change theater, and so that's what we're trying to do with Malu. We're trying to flip the lens. The organization isn't the hero, it's the human.
So you mentioned the word fear. I want to dig into that a little bit more. And for those who are joining us live, know this is not a prepared question, so we are testing Melissa on the spot as we speak here. So a lot of times when we talk about change management and when we're talking about enterprise change initiative, there is a notion that fear sells. When you put a human in a position of fear, they will move, they will change behavior, and they will motivate themselves to pivot accordingly. I want to know what your take is, and Michelle, I would also love to know what your take is on motivation through fear and uncertainty and doubt in the environment of just human behavior as well as organizational change.
I'm going to answer this question as a mother of two little ones, okay? And so if you think I have a 4.5-year-old and a 2-year-old, and so if I'm trying to change behavior by screaming at them, and yeah, you might get compliance, right? But then you get an adult later on in life that's afraid to speak up for his or her own value systems, and that they're learning to shrink themselves. So I think that we need to look at motivation and fear similarly, because in an organization, that's all you're getting, compliance, but that at the risk of what? Lost innovation, lost trust in the organization, lost collaboration, lost engagement. It's just a lose-lose.
Michelle, what's your take?
I love that. I think also I tend to come at these problems from an education perspective, where I feel that so much of what's good about what can happen in an organization, as in life, is can we collectively learn? And fear can change behavior, but if you don't balance it with integration, then it doesn't become learning, right? It's just this rote, like, I want to avoid getting shocked by the thing, so I'm going to go over here. And then in the long term, it makes a very brittle organization because then people don't know why they're doing what they're doing. They're just doing it because they don't want to get fired or they don't want to get in trouble. And then all of the energy, to Melissa's point, that could have gone into whether that's innovation, paying attention to things, doing a good job, just like, being fully present goes into avoiding things. And then over time, that's when you get the kind of disastrous, like the other side of anti-fragile, you get organizations that suddenly fall apart or the floor falls out from underneath you because, yeah, these people weren't actually thinking in Awake and Online. You created a culture where they're mostly focused on their own survival. And in the long term, things that look intact can suddenly fall apart. And also, just from a human values perspective, that sucks. Like, it sucks to go to work in that environment. And if you're building an organization, it's a very sad legacy to leave on the earth that you made a bunch of people feel that way. And for what? Like, for short-term behavior change that in many cases, the value and the profit that can be gained from that is very quickly lost. It feels tempting to do it in the moment, like, let me just scare everyone and get into line. But we live in a world that's so chaotic and changing that you instill those lessons, they work for, I don't know, a few quarters, and then it's unaligned again. So what are you going to do? It's just not a good move, even though I understand why leaders sometimes turn to it because they're scared. They're like, I need everyone to get in line because I need to hide the fact that I don't really know how to navigate this.
Yeah, I totally hear you. And I think what both of you share, which is this notion of fear driving the survival instinct, driving compliance, is also partially what's breaking down the trust equation across enterprises right now in terms of, do I really trust as an employee that my employer has my best interest at heart when it comes to what's right and doing what's right? So with that in mind, Melissa, I want to get into talking about the nuances of it, right? So we know what doesn't work. We know fear doesn't work, but what does work? Like, talk to us about a time when you realize that the traditional change model just isn't cutting it anymore, and why and how you think taking a human-centric approach would have changed the narrative.
It's a good question. If I were to answer honestly, it wasn't just like a point in time. I think it was from the very beginning and when I got introduced to organizational psychology that something felt off in my gut. I was brought up in like the Cotter way of things, so like a very linear step-by-step process. And at that time, before my own internal transformation, like as an Asian, American daughter of two immigrants, like I was just honoring and following directions. Okay, so I was in a different mindset at that time, but something felt off because I didn't fully, truly believe the processes while I was supposed to be the lead of these multi-million-dollar like technology implementations, right? And so I think I've always, and I didn't know how to name it, but I always tried to infuse a little bit more human back into the work that I did because it just didn't exist. The process didn't exist. So I'll give you an example. One reason why I enjoyed being in the org effectiveness side of the house is because we often get access to systems that are quite broken. And for those that have ever worked with me, they will know that I have a different way of doing things with regards to change management. It's if I get access to like an inequitable system, even if it's not part of the statement of work, I try to inject it back. Like, who are our unsung heroes? Are we bringing in people? Is there enough representation across all of our business divisions? Are we including people that run the business, not just grow the business? So I can't say it's just a pinpoint. It's just always been something I felt was lacking that I always try to be in search of and overcompensate with kind of injecting more of the human in the system.
Can you take us through a couple more practical examples of how you managed to inject the human back into the system, even on a very, very hardwired framework of how quote unquote change management should be done in the enterprise?
So there's this like activity or tactic called like change ambassadors, right? And I like the tactic. It's really finding like local cheerleaders for the change initiative that you're doing. That there's culture ambassadors, there's I've been an ambassador, but oftentimes those ambassadors all look the same. Like depending on the system itself, like they are all friends of the executives or something. The same people. It's so usually like the same people are tapped for those stretch assignments. But as an Asian woman that was taught to be like silent and just keep your head down and work really hard, I'm not that shiny object that someone would be like, "Oh, let's take Melissa and do that." So that's a long-winded answer to say that I try to find those unsung heroes, the people that might not match the same type of behaviors. So for change ambassadors, I'm like, okay, do we have the right people? Like, what's the criteria? Do we have enough people from all geographies? Like, are we looking at people that might have different generational experiences, lived experiences? Is there gender differences in how, because when you think about change, it's going to be different based on other people's lived experiences. So you can't one size fits all change because that doesn't exist.
What do you mean? With all the comms templates and email templates, we can't one size fits all communication to make sure that as long as we talk to people, they move their behaviors?
Exactly. It's
clearly you can tell I have PTSD from org change management. Okay, so with that in mind, Michelle, I wanted to know from your lens, from a research academic angle, can you just walk us through what it means to be human and to go through change, like at a very sort of, I guess, Darwinian level? What do we experience and how can we think about that differently?
Oh gosh. Well, okay. The first thing that I'll say, wait, before I answer this question, I just want to honor what you were saying earlier, Melissa, because I saw that spirit in you when we were working together. Like you would always be the person being like, this person did a great job, or like, hey, thank you for saying that to people in the team. And I really do think it changed the vibe in the room. So I just want to honor, like, yes, you have always been like that, like the unsung heroes thing. I really felt that.
Thanks, Michelle.
Yeah. To answer the Darwinian question, I'm not a big fan of Darwin, but I'll speak to the human side a little bit. I think the first thing is that like change is natural to the world. Like I think one thing that organizational change management gets wrong is that we think of the static as the default. And then we say, oh, here I am coming in from a position of power, introducing change. Get ready, everyone. You were standing still, but now we're going to move. It's like, that's not true. Like, look at the natural world. We're all constantly changing. Like the default state is change. So then I think the question is, there's change that comes from the external environment changing, that you have to adapt, like your hometown floods or something, you have to figure out what to do, displacement, immigration, things like that. And then there's internal change, which is, oh gosh, I thought I wanted to be a doctor, but now that I've been in a few surgeries, this is not for me. Maybe I should pick a different path. And I think that there's a way to do the external in a way that more closely feels like the internal. And I feel like that's what we're talking about here. And to me, that's a process of learning and of integration. It's like the world is not always going to behave in the way that you want it to behave. We can't fully control the environment, despite our many millennia of creating technology to try to do that. But we can change our attitude of, okay, my hometown has flooded. How do I actively move through that process of grief? Really think about what that means for me until I can reach a place where I can face the future with optimism or at least curiosity. And that just takes a lot of work, and it takes skills and it takes learning. I feel like what you all are teaching at Malu is very much that. It's like, how do you become conscious of that process so that when wild things happen to you, and that's the world that we live in, you're not as paralyzed by it. And you're going, okay, this sucks, but I'm actually going to consciously move through the different stages of coming to terms with it so that I can move forward in a way that's authentic to me. I think from the position of just a person having change happen to you, that's how I would say it. And then there's a whole other layer of, as leaders, how do we think about our power in pushing change upon other people? And that's a whole other thing because, I use the example of a flood. That's a natural thing. That's no one's fault unless there was a poorly designed dam or something. Sometimes it is PR fault. Let's just say it was a natural flood. But then there's a whole world of sometimes, you as a leader, you're effectively flooding your own organization without the right forethought or not preparing for it. And so there's also that whole world as well. I don't know if that answers your question, but
it does, and it's incredibly thoughtful. So thank you for that. So before I pivot our conversation more into the seasons of change, based on everything that we just talked about and everything you've thought about as we were preparing for this session, what are some of the practical design or practice tips, if you will, that you can share with our audience about effectively executing and just surviving or managing through change in both their personal and professional lives? Whoever wants to start.
I can start. Okay, I can start. Yeah, you saw me breathing intentionally. There's a concept that we teach in need finding that continues to be very relevant in my life, and I think it's relevant in change management too. And it's this idea of seeing the water, and that's a metaphor that we use in qualitative research to say there are these sort of invisible forces that guide people's way of seeing the world. It's like your internal metaphor or framework for a situation or for your life. And one thing that seems to continually be true, when I look at the world and work with organizations and change, is that it's very difficult to change people's water. It can be done, but it's usually a huge struggle and an uphill battle. And the important thing is often what we need is a behavior change and not a full-on water change. And so there are really clever ways to change behavior while respecting and working with people's water. And that could be cultural. It could be, I'll give you one example. On Stanford campus many years ago, we were having a lot of bike accidents. This is a case study that Michael Berry teaches in our class. And there was this huge campaign from the university, change management. They were like, we got to stop these bike accidents. We're going to give everyone, all the freshmen, these beautiful branded Stanford helmets this one year. Yeah, okay, right. Okay, so the change manager in the room is like, no. Okay, so that's what happened. So the freshmen showed up and it was like, hey, check out this free helmet. Like, make sure you always wear your helmet. And the transportation department was like, amazing. We can't wait to see these numbers go down. We've solved everything. Yeah, you both already know the answer or like the punchline. Obviously, bike accidents did not go down. They actually went up that year. Obviously, correlation is not causation. So I'm not trying to say the helmets caused more accidents, but we know for sure it didn't help. And then the administration was like, they're not wearing the helmets. We should start ticketing them and using the police to catch people for not wearing helmets. And then, of course, the students really resisted and didn't like that because this is like a freedom of speech issue, I guess, in a way, freedom of dress. Like they were like, you can't force me to wear a helmet. This is Freedom Town. And so there was a lot of tension. And long story short, I'll fast forward to the end. Finally, what happened, they hired Michael and a bunch of researchers to be like, help us manage this because the students hate us and we're not fixing the bike issue. They talked to a bunch of students and what they realized was they were right. Students don't wear helmets. But the reason they don't wear helmets was there was something about Stanford culture that was very like pro-resilience. It was very like, I don't want to look lame. I don't want to have helmet head. I don't want to look like defensive and fragile. And especially freshmen, because they just got here, right? This was like, you dreamed about this your whole life. You're still kind of blinking, like, did I really get into Stanford? You feel like you're going to wake up one day and the admin's going to be like, sorry, it was a mistake. Please go home. So there's a lot of imposter syndrome. And so they get to campus. No one else is wearing a helmet. And there's this vibe of like, I belong here. I'm a Stanford student. Like, I don't wear a helmet. I don't need to wear a helmet. That was more important to them than safety. And so you had students saying, I own a helmet, but I won't wear it on campus because I feel like a loser. I only wear it when I get off campus. So it wasn't even that they didn't have a helmet. They totally did. It's just that they were choosing belonging over safety. And so now the administration had a choice. They could be like, let's do a huge culture change campaign and get people to wear their helmets. But to their credit, they were like, let's go back to what we really want change-wise. If we want to just like lower bike accidents, can we do that without trying to change the total culture of Stanford University, which is a very difficult thing to do? And it turns out that that's what they decided to do. They were like, well, back to the drawing board. where are the accidents happening? They were happening at four-way stops. And the reason was the cars would stop and follow the rules. And the bikes would do this. I'm resilient. I'm Stanford. I adjust. I'm adaptable. I run through stop signs. That's how people bike on campus. It's everything is flowing. No one ever stops. And so when these two cultures clashed, you got terrible accidents because the cars would hit the bikes. Because the cars would be like, well, the bike is going to stop. And the bike would be like, well, the car is going to respect the fact that I'm going really fast. So they put in roundabouts. They tore up all these four-way stops. Ariadne Scott, who was in the transportation department, had this idea that people thought was crazy at the time. And if you visit Stanford now, the border of campus is called Campus Drive. The major intersections are all roundabouts, which is kind of crazy for an American university. It's very unorthodox to have that many roundabouts, and it actually stresses out the cars a lot. And if you talk to the car drivers, which they did in this project, they would say things like, I don't like this. I have to pay attention. I feel like anyone could come from any space, any place. And the brilliant thing is, from a design perspective, that works because that's how students feel all the time. So using infrastructure, you got the cars to think like students and put them on the same water, on the same script. And all of a sudden, the bike accidents went down a lot. And to me, that's a beautiful story of change management because it's not just the people you're trying to change. You can change the environment, the flows of things. You can be disciplined about what really matters to you. And in this case, that was bike accidents. And they were able to achieve that without trying to fundamentally change who people were. They respect, you know what? This Stanford student culture has been around for so long, and let's just leave it. That this is part of our material that we're working with. It's a cultural material. So how do we work with it instead of against it? And that's what they did, and they got what they wanted. And
that's amazing.
Way, yeah.
Yeah, anyway, I feel like if I were to sound clip this, it would just be don't change the water, and we're going to run a short clip over all of this because I think it's a very fundamental philosophy a lot of organizations get wrong, in that if people don't change, there is something wrong with the people and not necessarily the design, the environment that you put them in. So Melissa, over to you. What are some practical sort of design tips that you have for our audience in terms of managing change or executing change in their personal or professional lives?
Real quick, Lydia, when you said don't change the water, I thought the motto was going to be like, don't wear the yellow helmets. Anyway,
and
okay.
Don't waste money on helmets, yes.
To walk, it actually is a similar answer to Michelle's answer, just without the roundabouts. But I think that from a professional perspective, I think that organizations plan for like skill development or like the tools for you to reach a certain behavior, but they don't account for the emotion. So it's emotion as well as the skills. And, there was something that came up in a recent study that, when Michelle was saying that the Stanford team or the Stanford students were choosing belonging over safety. If you were to take that and put it into a professional setting, what we found in our research is that someone who might be resisting change and dubbed like the resistor, gotta go, could just be a person really affirmed in their values, and then when you take a step back from it, you're like, what scorecard are we evaluating ourselves on in life to begin with, and so I think that pulling out, like I was a victim of allowing a company scorecard to have too much weight in terms of defining my own personal worth. Once I decoupled that, I feel a lot more free. I think we should design for the people that we are, the identities, the very variety of identities, and design for the people that we are also becoming. So whether or not we're advising like a Fortune 100 executive, rebuilding after a burnout, or we're not just going to talk about goals. We need to excavate the parts of them that need to be retired, redefined, reclaimed, because if the who doesn't change, the what isn't going to stick. And so I think from a personal and professional, I still think the answer is the same. It's alignment. So like to give example, like with Malu, We have therapy to look back. We have coaching to move forward. That dual lens, like, is a secret to change that actually lasts. Most change models are either, too soft or too sharp. But we built Malu to both be strong and soulful at the same time. And I like, I loved what Michelle just said. I jotted it down. It was like, the change worked at Stanford with the bicycles because they decided from the design to become part of who they were, versus working against it. And I think we just need more of that, both in our personal and professional lives. And I think if you take one thing away, design your life like it deserves honoring and reverence, I think is probably the right word, not just a strategy.
Yeah. And can I just pick on the word that both of you have used quite a bit? I don't even know if you counted the number of times you've used it. No, the idea of design. Because here's the thing. I think and a lot of times when we approach change personally, professionally, we treat it as an after effect, right? Like this thing happened. Now I have to go and deal with it. Like I'm rolling out a new technology. Now you got to go deal with it. I'm changing the org structure. Now you got to go deal with it. Instead of an intentional design element to say, if I were to change A, B, C, D, E, F, G, what are some of the things that we got to look for? What are the human behaviors that we can bend? What is that water that we can't touch? What are the infrastructure aspects that we can design around and things along those lines? And I think it's the idea of intentionality and design that a lot of times that we forget. And with the idea of design in mind, I want to pivot us to the next part of the conversation, which is let's talk about seasons for a second, right? Like, because a lot of times we work full-time jobs and it's 40 plus hours per week, which takes a bulk of our lives. So a lot of times when we experience change, we don't automatically bifurcate to say, this is personal, that's professional, let's kind of figure it out. We handle it in the entirety of our human existence and experience. Yeah. So with that in mind, Melissa, a question for you. What are the seasons of change that people go through that doesn't show up in the org chart, that doesn't show up in the box with their title and everything else? And how do you consider the incorporation of that whole human into the experience?
Okay. I mean, there's multiple seasons, right? I think there's seasons of identity loss. There's seasons of false starts. There's seasons of burnout. There's also seasons of what I call, like, instead of breakdowns, they're breakthroughs, like reckonings. Because people aren't linear, and some might be going through those seasons on a personal basis. And then on top of it, going through a season, in their job. So we got to stop. Our systems need to stop assuming that we're all machines. We're more like living and breathing forests, not factories. And if I were to provide kind of like how, back to your design word, like how could someone design for an emotional season, and not just project milestones or the, what Excel spreadsheet, like you said, Lydia. I think it's important to, as part of your plan, map the invisible, budget for grief, celebrate endings, build in pause and not just push. And please, for the love of God, stop calling layoffs a restructure and pretending morale can be re-engaged with the pizza party. But just my tip for the day.
I'm going to clip that one on top of the don't do a helmet thing. I feel like we have a lot of key takeaways here. Don't roll out helmets, and pizza parties are probably not going to solve your life's problem, although they are delicious, that said. Okay, so with that bit, Michelle, I want to pivot to the work that you're doing with Malu Journey, because I think it's great research into the seasons people go through, the idea of irrelevant identity loss as we go through those seasons. So can you share a little bit more on that?
Yes, I want to start by just also acknowledging we did this work with one other researcher, my wonderful colleague and friend, Yamaria Mamo, who graduated from the master's program in design at Stanford. Yeah, so good. And when we went into this project, I will say every time you go into a research project, you have some sense of what you think you're going to encounter. And so I came in with this sense, and sometimes it's pre-verbal. And the second the interview started, Yamaria and I turned to each other and we were like, this is not what we thought. And I think one of the biggest takeaways and one of the biggest things we had to reckon with in this work, so just as background, for Malu, we talked to a bunch of very high-performing women in the corporate world and surrounding. Sometimes they were also a nonprofit. about how they manage change in their own lives and think about these big transitions and the personal versus work, and all of these topics we've been talking about in this webinar. So we get into these interviews, and Yamiram and I were like, we are stressed, because in the interviews there would be this narrative of like, everything's good, it's fine, these things happen, but that's just what life is like, and I was like running downstairs to feed my kids in between the Zoom meetings, and then running back upstairs fixing my hair and turning on the camera, but that's how life is. We were like, is that how life is? And so we were leaving. Often as qualitative researchers, your whole body becomes a kind of antenna or sensor. It's not just what the words you're hearing, but the whole human dimension of like, emotionally, what am I picking up? What am I feeling? What is being communicated, not just in someone's face, but also their body language and their tone. And a lot of what was coming off was this feeling of extreme pressure, this internal pressure of, I know the narrative I have to fit into. It's what Melissa was talking about, the earlier part of her journey. And I know that so clearly. I know that like the back of my hand. I know the character I have to play. And so even in this conversation with both of you researchers, I'm going to play that. And on some level, I'm playing that character to myself because I don't have an alternative. So it's not the case that these really, really amazing, talented, ambitious women were like, I have to impress Michelle and Yamiram. I need to come off really well. But deep down, I know I'm not okay. It was even deeper than that. It was like, the only way I know how to be okay is to deeply pretend to be okay. And hopefully things will resolve themselves somehow in the background as I sleep. And what we eventually found throughout the research was there was a range of how people related to that pressure cooker chamber inside. Some people had what we felt like was more of an integrated version of this, where they were actually in touch with themselves and they could more clearly communicate, that was a horrible time for me. I really struggled. I had a breakdown. It became a breakthrough, but dang, But then there were other people who were very much caught in this earlier mode that was like, I need to perform for everyone, including myself. And it's not to blame the people involved, but I think what we realized through this project is just the pressures of working at that level in the corporate world for a lot of women. That is just what we've inherited. Like, this is the supposedly post-feminist world where women get to, engage in work and be high achieving. But there's this very invisible burden of emotional performance and having it together in a way that really does still disproportionately fall upon women. Like, if a male leader loses his cool, people are much more willing to be like, oh, that's just Bob. Sometimes he gets like that. They move on. The next day, everyone goes back to work and pretends it doesn't happen. Women don't, in general, we don't really have as much leeway. If we lose our cool visibly like that, it's like, wow, that was unprofessional, or like, is she really qualified? And so I think these are psychological adaptations to a real environment. It's not like, why are these women so high strung? It's very much like, this speaks to the environment you've been in, that you've had to adapt in this way and take on this identity, because the pressures are real. Yeah.
Yeah.
It was intense. I don't know that. Yeah.
I bet. So we talk a lot about identity loss, fear of irrelevance, right? And I think when we look at it from an organizational or even like a personal standpoint, a lot of times we think it's about control. It's about the fact that we need to have control over our environment, and therefore that is why we're change resistant. But we know it goes a lot deeper and is a lot more nuanced than that. So Melissa, I'm going to throw this question at you. How does the notion of identity and like fear of irrelevance play into change resistance? What are some of the observable things and the not so nuanced things?
This one is personal. So, after I was laid off, I don't think I was just grieving a job loss. I was grieving a version of myself that I had identified with, the partner, the performer, the provider, right? And so when you don't know who you are anymore, you kind of cling on to like what's familiar, even if it no longer fits. So I think, that's what resistance really is sometimes. It's not defiance necessarily. It could be fear. And I think in corporate change, we make room for that level of we rarely make room for that level of identity work, but it's the only way to get to the other side without breaking people in the process. I don't think change is hard because it's new. I think it's hard because it threatens who we think we are. I don't think the resistance is for the new operating model. I think it's a fear of becoming irrelevant or disposable. I think if we don't name that, we will keep mistaking trauma for low engagement.
Wow. That was a powerful one, mistaking trauma for low engagement. I think Michelle just had a mic drop moment there as well. So Michelle, I'm going to come over to you. What's your take on this, right? Like, how do you think change would look different if we just viewed it through a different lens as Melissa has described?
I think this is one of the most important questions in like organizational theory that faces us in our moment in history, actually, because I don't have the answer. I think that we are on the back of many decades of centering the individual in culture. And so now we have that understanding of like, if you go into the world of therapy, we've been talking about therapy earlier, I think we have more robust models than ever before of like, grief takes time. It takes time to adjust to a new identity. You have to mourn the loss of the old identity. And you can't just expect someone to bounce back right away. So from an individual perspective, if you talk to your therapist, they will be like, you are a whole person, it's all good. But then you have the organizational context, often within these capitalistic frameworks of we have to make this growth, we have to do this, here are our targets. And that whole world is like, what is your model of the individual? Like, it seems extremely not sophisticated, right? It's like people are either doing what they're supposed to do or they're not.
Mm-hmm.
And change management is moving people from A to B. And that's it. It's like, what? Did we just, these two worlds are not talking to each other? And I don't know what they would look like if they were well integrated. I think that's one of the biggest challenges we have facing us. I think in smaller organizations, it's a little bit easier. There's more give. People know each other. It's much less like we have to hit these targets. In large organizations, I think there's I think the great challenge is innovating around this now. Like, no one has figured this out. What does it mean to do this at a large scale? To me, that's an enormous question, and I'm very interested in it because it's a very, very tough problem. But I do think that our current approach of these two worlds not talking to each other is clearly not working. Like, I think the change management side of continuing to see people as basically static, you can't reform that into being good. Does that make sense? You can't make tiny incremental changes on that model because fundamentally it doesn't see people as dynamic and complex. You probably have to rebuild a model from different base assumptions. And I think the change management world has, frankly, made a lot of money promising that we can approach something that's fundamentally chaotic and dynamic with, as you were saying, Lydia, control. And that is a very lucrative selling point. I wish that were true. Like, oh, if you just hire us, you don't have to worry about the messy, it'll all go smoothly. It's like, what are you talking about? Like, if someone's promising that to you, it's highly unlikely they're going to be able to actually execute on it. And I think the people who've lived through change management or who have been change managed can speak firsthand to the fact that a certain level of control and smoothness was promised. But alas, the reality is very different. So
I feel like we might have just picked a bone with an entire industry there, but I am completely with you in terms
my
of
views
promising
represent
approach.
myself only, and neither Malu nor Stanford. The only organization I represent is the one I started, which is Sundog. So I speak only for myself. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you for that. So, folks, we are coming up to the top of the hour here. So if you're still with us in the audience and you're enjoying this conversation, please feel free to drop any comments, questions you have for our panelists here, and we will get to those live. But with that said, I do have a question for both of you, right? And that it's something to do with the fact that a formulaic approach is easy. it is insanely easy to whip out a sort of trademarked change model. Not going to mention them out of fear that we might pick a bone with them again. It is incredibly easy to whip out trademark change models. It is incredibly easy to take out Excel spreadsheets. It is incredibly easy to fill templates, identify milestones, and say the percentage of change you want to achieve by a certain milestone. How should someone, on the other hand, design for the emotional seasons that we just talked about, design for the human and not the project milestones? What tips do you have for folks trying to do that?
I have a hypothesis. So what, Michelle, you said the big question, I'm like challenge accepted. Like, I wonder, I would love to pilot, like, what if we stopped measuring success by adoption rates, and start measuring it by the depth of healing? And I wonder, I don't know what that is yet, but I think that the most transformed teams I've ever seen, they didn't just hit KPIs, they became like braver, kinder, maybe even more like aware, awake, if you will. And I think that's what real return on investment should look like, both personally and within an organization.
Awesome. Michelle?
Yeah, to just build on that, I think a really important first step is just building a collective language around it, around those dimensions of human life and normalizing them. Because I think when we have a language to talk about it, it becomes culturally acceptable. And then we can learn how to work with and dance around that and with that. I think, like, I don't know, work culture has already changed so much since when I first entered the workforce. I feel like in recent years, and maybe this is also the organizations I've gotten the honor to work with recently, but there's been much more honesty. Like, if people need to step away because they're having mental health struggles, they need to take a mental health day. That's way more okay than when I started working. When I started working, for someone to be like, I need to take a mental health, it's like, what is that? What do you mean? Are you okay? But now it's part of our lexicon. And I think we need more of that. Like, speaking of the seasons, can we even talk to each other about our seasons? Is there a way that we can clearly say, I'm going through a winter right now. This is just where I'm at. Great. Like, now we understand that organizationally, like, I'm going to check in with Michelle a little bit more because I know she's going through a tough time. And it doesn't have to be this brittle performative, like, Michelle's not working in high summer, like, we should think about layoffs. It's much more like, hey, we know you. We know you're talented. We know you're good. Everybody goes through this. You're in this. I remember when I was in this. We can just gently adjust around that. Like, maybe now's not the time to ask you to take on a whole other project, which is cool because now this is an opportunity for someone else in the organization to grow so they can take it on. But I think it starts by having this language around it. And I don't feel like we have it. Like, I feel like there's a segregation of language. Like, this is how we talk about work. And then the personal life this is how I talk to my friends about life. But what are the words that we use to bring those two worlds together?
I love that. I also would love to redefine some of the language that I like resilience. My definition of resilience when I was in corporate America, living under a rock and like in culture, it was much different than what I believe resilience is now. Resilience is now for like my alignment, and I think there's the same defining that's required for like good and like high performer or like, I think that there's language that has some work to be done.
I love that. Yeah. Wait, do you want to say more about resilience? Because I feel like that was a big turning point for you in this project. Like, specifically, what did you think it was before?
And I thought resilience was like being able to work 80 hours when my team member worked 50 and to jump through 8,100, like 4 billion more hoops than everybody else to get to the same promotion as, Bob, if you will, like that you mentioned earlier.
Bob.
But now I realize resilience is actually like being me and knowing that that is more than enough, and so that has been a big, big, significant mental shift for me. And I'm loving it.
I love that. To me, I also think there's like, what I'm hearing and what you're saying is there's a shift from a quantitative approach to work to more of a purpose-driven approach, because the quantitative is like, well, I'm putting in more hours, I'm hitting these metrics, you can see it. But I think that when we're deeply aligned with ourselves, the kind of work that we can do and the kind of good we can do in the world completely changes. It's like, sure, you could have done 80 hours of work, but did it really improve the world? Or like, are you going to look back and be like, I'm proud of what I did or how I treated people when I was working on 5 hours of sleep? And I think there's the opportunity to open yourself up to the work that only you can do when you're well aligned, even if it looks like you're being less productive on paper. And it's also what I see you both doing, working on Malu, and leaving this high pressured world to be like, I want to make something that really reflects the values that I've always carried with me. I think that's very brave to do. And it's the kind of thing you can only do when you're like aligned with yourself. You can't do that while you're pretending to be somebody else.
Yeah. You just actually, both of your conversations just reminded me of something I wrote a couple weeks back, which is the idea that adoption is actually an emotion and not a metric.
Mm-hmm.
I think I want to leave that with our audience today in terms of just adoption is not a number. It's about taking the human through an entire process. Okay, so 2 minutes left, 1 minute each, really quick round robin. One practice that you will leave with our audiences with that actually works when everything feels stuck. What is the one thing that you recommend for them to do?
For me, it's simple. Like I was wired to just deliver, produce, get to the next level, like check off my checklist. And I think the best thing for me was to create space for pause and reflection. I never had that because it was always about chasing the next thing. So that would be my one tip.
Michelle?
That's so funny. We didn't plan this beforehand. I have a very similar tip. There's a saying around meditation, which I love, which is if you don't have time to meditate for 5 minutes, you should meditate for an hour.
Mm-hmm.
And I love that because often our internal sense of urgency is an illusion. It's an emotional state. It's not necessarily a response to constraints. It's not true in all industries. If you're a race car driver or like a trauma surgeon, the urgency is real. Okay, but a lot of us have really deeply inbuilt senses of urgency that are misplaced, actually. And I think when you're working from that place, you can often make things worse. And so taking the time to check in with yourself, with your team, like, we don't have time to ask how everyone's feeling.
Right.
Are you sure? What are you doing then? Like, things are going to go wrong if over time people are not even fully in the room. Like, we start all of our classes at Stanford with a check-in. And if we just go around the room where, like, say one word to describe how you're feeling, it doesn't have to make sense. It could be anything. So some students are like, fluffy, clouds. And it's a very tiny gesture, but it makes me very happy because to me, it symbolizes our commitment to, we're here to teach and learn, and we can't do that unless you're fully in the room.
Yes, I think that's a myth that about change that needs to die. Like, because people like, I don't think people resist change all the time. I think they resist bullshit and they resist being changed without being seen, And so like being seen is huge. And without creating those micro behaviors, like you were saying, Michelle, I think it can make a huge difference. It's that temperature check. It's the Lydia's adoption is is emotion measurement.
Awesome. And with that in mind, that brings us to the top of the hour. So thank you so much for everyone joining us. Thank you, Melissa and Michelle, for joining us for this session, the very first of the Malu Journey series of webinars on the seasons of change. This recording will be made available via our YouTube channel later on as well, and it will be available for replay on LinkedIn Live. So if you missed any bit of it, please hit the replay button, and we look forward to seeing you again next time.
Thanks, everyone.